The next section is entitled "A Lead in Development is an Ideal" and starts as follows. If I were running a race with someone, it would at least be a waste of precious time to stop in order to blow my nose, though there is nothing wrong with blowing one's nose. But if I could oblige my opponent to indulge in some similar time-wasting activity, this would allow me to achieve a lead in development. Such an action might be the repeated moving around of one and the same piece. So, one forces the opponent to waste time if one is able to simultaneously develop a piece of one's own and to attack an already developed piece of one's opponent. And this very idea and position can come around, for example, in the Scandinavian defense. After e takes d5, queen takes d5, and knight c3. And this combines development with the winning of tempo, because the queen's going to have to move, so white gains something here. And this maneuver can be described as a compound one, in that the purpose behind capturing with the e takes d5 was, in order to play knight c3 on the next move. So there's two components there, so it's a compound, and in so doing to attain a lead in development. And understanding the significance of this is of great importance for people just starting out in chess, as the entire sequence would seem absurd without the knowledge of what has taken place. Here's another example. d4, d5, c4, and now let's say black plays knight f6. And if you want to try and guess the move that runs with the idea that we've been talking about, then stop the video now. C takes d5 is of course the move, and regardless of how black recaptures, white is going to gain a tempo. If queen takes d5, knight c3 as before, and if knight takes d5, e4. And in both cases, white's move is a valid developing move, and one that black must meet by developing one of his pieces for a second time. Moreover, Nimzowitsch writes, the beginner will perhaps be wondering, why should black recapture? Many a solid businessman shows when playing chess an unworldly delicacy of feeling and does not recapture. But a master is unfortunately well aware that he is compelled, unavoidably, to recapture, because otherwise the material balance of power would be disturbed. This fact, that such pressure does exist, means that by recapturing our opponent is delayed in his development, except for those cases in which the piece recapturing is by some coincidence also making a developing move. So now we can go to the next section, and a further example of what Nimzowitsch was talking about just there goes e4, e5, f4, and now knight f6. It's one of the variations of the King's Gambit. So f takes e5, and black is forced to play knight takes e4, or he simply goes a pawn down, which is no good, obviously. So knight f3 in order to prevent queen h4 check, knight c6, and now what would you play in accordance with the rules that we've just been discussing? If you want to try and spot it, then stop the video now. d3 is the answer, of course, and the logical follow-up to having captured on e5 in order to make this knight move around, because now the knight can only go to c5. There's no other square it can move to, or it's gonna get just taken. So it has to go to c5. Now comes d4, again developing with tempo. Just make space for the bishop, so it can be counted as part of development because it helps development. And after knight e4, d5. All these space gaining pawn moves for free. Knight b8, and you know, here white can even win further tempi with bishop d3, or even knight b d2, because if black now plays knight takes d2, he's moving the same piece for the 5th time in order to capture the piece, a piece that has only moved once. So essentially he's losing 4 tempi, the drawbacks of which are clear visually. After bishop takes d2, black has had absolutely no useless moves. Ostensibly this knight has moved out and back in again, and you know, there's just nothing going on here, whereas white has had these pawn moves can count as 4 moves, you know, at least, maybe even more, because they've been moving 1 square at a time. So 4, 5, 6 moves, and black's had none. So you know, the advantage is clear. And upon this, Nimzowitsch comments that, you know, for black it's just like a farmer who's lost a piglet when he lost the knight here. Lost a piglet to disease, and he regrets not only the piglet having died, but also all the good feed he's invested in the piglet, which is, you know, obviously the moves that that knight took with it when it was taken off the board. So that's something that's also good to consider for the opening phase. And Nimzowitsch also makes the point that sometimes there will be an intermezzo between exchanging and gaining the tempo, that is an intermediate move. For example, in the opening, e4, e5, f4, another way that black can play is d5. So e takes d5, queen takes d5, knight c3, and now let's say black plays queen e6. And white can and now should play f takes e5 in order to gain a tempo on the queen. Because after queen takes e5, this square is unstable for the queen. Knight f3 or d4 is coming. Development with tempo. And you know, something that might discourage white from going for this is that after queen takes e5 is check. But this is where the intermezzo occurs. White can play bishop e2, and he'll be able to follow up on the next move with knight f3 or d4, developing with tempo. For example, if bishop g4 to stop knight f3, white can play d4 instead. And after bishop takes e2, knight g takes e2 is best. Taking the queen is just, it's not good. I think it's losing a piece. No, it's not losing a piece, but it's not as good. This continuation. White has gained tempo, but his development is not so hot. Whereas if it goes with knight g takes e2, tempo is gained now with queen e6, and now we can castle. And obviously, this is much better than what we just looked at, and white will enjoy a subsequent huge lead in development. He's made 5 tempo winning moves to reach this position, whilst black has only 1 tempo to show for his efforts, the queen being on e6, but the queen can be chased again with moves like knight f4, which is threatened next, so the lead in development is probably worth 5 extra moves here. And you know, in this position there's no concrete and forcing line to gain a winning advantage immediately, but usually if your opponent gives you 5 moves for free, you should be able to create something. Okay, so on to the next section. This next section is entitled Liquidation followed by Development or a Bid for Freedom. Nimzowitsch writes, whenever a businessman sees that an investment is going badly for him, he does well to liquidate that investment so that he can put the proceeds into a better one. But unfortunately, from time to time, other tactics are tried. The businessman borrows in order to pay off a debt, and keeps on doing so until the evil day arrives when he borrows on one hand and on the other he does not pay. That is not very pleasant, is it? When we transfer this idea to chess, I mean the sort of situation when development is threatened with being held up, and we have to turn to radical measures since mere stopgaps will not help. Let me first explain this with an example. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and d4. It's the Scotch game. And let's say black answers with d5. And this move can be considered dubious, since the second player should not immediately imitate such an enterprising move as d4 from Nimzowicz's words, not mine. So e takes d5 is how we exploit this. After queen takes d5, knight c3, aiming to gain a tempo as we just saw. But now comes bishop b4, pinning the knight and preventing the loss of tempo. But now white answers bishop d2, and the pin is broken, and it's pretty much forces bishop takes c3. So bishop takes c3, it's just a correct recapture, or white is simply losing a pawn. And now black has to think about the situation, and in so doing he will come to the conclusion that he should play e takes d4. And this is the correct continuation because black wants to liquidate, because he's gone slightly wrong. Playing instead e4 here, which can be considered a retreat, or bishop g4 is wrong, as there's no time for this kind of thing during the stage of development. So after knight takes d4, so as bishop takes e3 has been played. Now e takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, and black has released the tension in the center and cannot be said to be behind in development. So this is something to bear in mind if you feel that something has gone wrong whilst you're developing your pieces. Release the central tension as much as possible and then simply continue development. So it's liquidation followed by development. Next example is after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4 and d5. Same opening again. White can also play bishop b5 here, pinning the knight and threatening knight takes e5. And this creates quite a problem for black, as it appears that both bishop d7 to break this pin and bishop g4 have drawbacks. For example, if bishop d7 is just dropping a pawn, and a valuable one, after e takes d5, knight takes d4, bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, knight takes d4, e takes d4, queen takes d4. Black's a pawn down with virtually no compensation. And if instead bishop g4, this runs into difficulty after h3, which is a forcing move, and it's one of the rare occasions where this is a good move. So bishop takes f3 must be played. If instead bishop h5, then g4, bishop g6, and knight takes e5. And this pin is a problem. A pawn has been lost. The bishop pair will be lost. It's going to give black a big headache. So bishop takes f3 is forced, and now queen takes f3. And from this square, the queen has a decisive effect on the central tension here. Knight f6 is pretty much forced to try and hold up, and now black doesn't have time to liquidate. For example, if instead he plays e takes d5 here, e takes d5, the queen is protecting d5, and the knight can't move because it's pinned. It's very strong. A6 is forced here, but then it just gets messy and it really favors white. And if instead d takes e4, and now queen takes e4, and again white has a big advantage. This pin is annoying. d5 is coming, e takes d4 is impossible, queen takes d4 is no good. To check here is decisive. It's just a disaster. So knight f6 is pretty much forced. So now white can answer e takes d5, and black can't recapture here, or he's going to lose a pawn on e5. So the correct move is e4. And now queen e3 is best. Now queen takes d5, c4. And white continues to enjoy a nice advantage, and this d4 pawn of course is immune because this knight is pinned. So instead of running into these evils, you know, every choice there is bad for black. What he should have done is liquidated when he had the chance at move 4 after bishop b5. Here he can play d takes e4, and this would have been right. Knight takes e5 is the best way for white to continue, and this can be answered with bishop d7. The threat of course was knight takes c6, b takes c6, check, and winning the rook. This breaks that pin, and it threatens knight takes e5, and there's no d takes e5 because the bishop would take on b5. So if the bishop takes on e7, then the knight recaptures and black's gain a piece, so there's a threat now to win a piece. White can continue with bishop takes c6, and after bishop takes c6 he can play knight c3 attacking e4. He can also castle, but black is not too bad after bishop d6, knight takes c6, b takes c6, knight c3, and f5. And you know, his development here is satisfactory. The double pawns aren't too much of a big deal, so knight c3 is probably better. So knight c3 and bishop b4, preserving the e pawn. So knight takes c6 followed up with knight takes e4 was threatened. So castles again brings that threat back to life. Bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and now Nimzowitsch gave knight e7 as best, avoiding the pin with bishop g5 if the knight goes to f6. And you know, play could continue, for example queen g4 attacking g7, castling, and this allows the winning of a pawn with knight takes c6, knight takes c6, queen takes e4, because black will have reasonable compensation after rook e8, just winning the e file, and after queen e3, knight a5. And now that the development has been completed, maneuvering can begin. Black can continue with something like c6, knight c4, queen d5, exploiting the weakened light squares in the white position. Thus a well-timed liquidation has put black back on the right track after his development became dubious. So again, if you find yourself in difficulties, then liquidation followed with, you know, development or a freeing move is a good idea to fix those problems. And it's important, you know, that you can see a good move at the end of the liquidation, like a tempo gaining move, or just even continued development, or even if you just free yourself from the pressure, it's a good choice. Okay, so we'll move on to the next one. Another example of what we're talking about here can be seen in the Giuoco piano. After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, c3, knight f6, now d4. It's a good move. Black is forced to give up his center with e takes d4. So now c takes d4, bishop b4 check, bishop d2. And this creates a threat now. Bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, queen b3 check, a king move, and then winning the piece back on b4 with this bishop and the queen on b3. And what's crucial for black here is to try and attack or break up the central white pawns, because as we've seen before, they're dangerously mobile here. Black hasn't played d6 or d5, and these knights are perpetually in fear of these pawn pushes. And here the correct way to do this is by playing d5, because we want to prevent both of them from moving forwards, and that can be played with tempo because of the bishop here. And this can't be done immediately with d5, or white answers e takes d5, and after knight takes d5 he plays bishop takes b4, knight c takes b4, and queen b3, and he's slightly better, you know, he's got pressure here on the d5 knight and latent pressure on f7, and then the knight can't move or this knight is falling, you know. It's not impossible for black to solve, but it's tricky. So it's correct instead to exchange on d2 first. Instead of playing d5, black will play bishop takes d2, and after knight b takes d2 he can now play the freeing move d5, because after e takes d5, knight takes d5, queen b3, now there's not so much pressure, and black has the strategic retreat knight c e7, and from this he can achieve a roughly equal game. Nimzowitsch follows this up with the observation that a properly employed exchange, as seen just here on d5, constitutes an excellent weapon and the basis for the typical maneuvers we have analyzed above, i.e. exchanged followed by a gain of tempo, as we saw earlier, or liquidation followed by either a developing move or a freeing move. And he goes on to say, but we must quite specifically warn against exchanging willy-nilly, because exchanging off of a piece which had moved several times for one of your opponents which had never moved would be a typical beginner's mistake. So exchanges should only be made in the above two cases, that being exchange followed by gain of tempo, or liquidation followed by either a developing move or a freeing move. So they're very good basic lessons to remember about the opening stage. Okay, that's the end of part 2.